I just wanted to do a sound check. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, my name is Isha. Thank you all for joining in, and I guess you're just in time. Just wanted to check if all of you, all the participants have joined, and secondly, if just you could do a quick mic check and a video check.
Yeah. Hi. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. If you could just speak a little louder, your voice is a little feeble.
Okay, is it better now?
Much better, thank you.
No worry.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Right, thank you.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Great.
Hi everyone, hope you can hear me.
All right, I think we should just begin. Just a bit of housekeeping rules. We just have we're quickly running out of time. So at 4:20, I'd be that pesky little person in the back telling you that it's time. And without further ado, I think we should begin all the best for your sessions. And I'll be in the background. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Lakshay, I request you to share your screens, please. Okay, so a very good afternoon to everyone present. We are very excited to bring you this jointly hosted session from Dwara Research and the Apti Institute on the opportunities, roles, and responsibilities of various stakeholders in open digital ecosystems for social protection, which we call SPODEs. Now, SPODEs are basically social protection tech platforms which deliver welfare benefits to citizens using interoperable digital infrastructure, such as citizen databases and ID systems. Now, this presentation builds on Dwara and Apti's existing work in this domain. I'll just request my co-presenters to put up some links to earlier work by both organizations into the chat box. For the past few years now, the Dwara team has been closely studying the developments in this field and has conceptualized a framework of citizen centricity to guide the design of these systems such that they work best for its intended users. We'll also be publishing some work in early 2023, and I invite our audience to follow our socials to really stay updated about the same. For this session, however, hosted in partnership with Apti, we are exploring the roles that various stakeholders might play in an SPODE setting. And while some of our earlier work has briefly touched upon this, it's really Apti that's taking forward this idea of stakeholderism in SPODEs. And we are very excited to see the direction that this work might take in the future. Now, with that quick introduction out of the way, I'll jump right into the content of our presentation. Lakshay, switch slides. Thank you. Now, all over India, we are seeing the prevalence of platform-based social protection delivery. We have seen the Janadhar system in Rajasthan, the Samagra system of Madhya Pradesh, and these are just some like examples of how SPODEs or social protection tech systems have surfaced in recent years in various state governments. All of these systems have some basic features in common in that they intend to provide citizens a single platform through which they can obtain a wide range of G2C services. Most importantly, social protection benefits from multiple government departments. Now, at the back end too, many of these systems look very similar in that they create process efficiencies for the administrator by eliminating the duplication of admin processes. Now, in the traditional paradigm of social protection delivery, a citizen would have to run pillar to post to obtain the range of social protection benefits that they were actually entitled to. So if I take the example of a daily wage laborer, they might have to approach, for instance, the program officer to receive an MGNREGA job card, and then the social welfare office for their old age pensions, and then maybe again the local kotedar for a ration card. And at each of these points, the person has to submit an application form, documents to prove who they are, and that they are in fact eligible, and prove that eligibility for each of those schemes. Now, of course, there are other barriers that stand in a prospective beneficiary's way: an uncooperative front-end staff, corruption, technical failures. There is a wide range of possibilities which already hampers access to social protection. And when clearly there is a fragmentation of the front end for the citizen, it just complicates things even further. Now, if all services could instead be provided by a single touch point to the citizen, it effectively reduces the barriers that stand between the citizen and the social protection system. Now, this fragmentation really reflects in the administrative process as well at the back end, since each department processes applications, verifies eligibility, and disburses benefits through standalone processes. Now, if departments could instead share information across each other, instead of adopting more siloed processes, then there could be various efficiencies which are created at the back end. Now, these are the two primary pillars that set the SPODE paradigm apart from the traditional models of social protection delivery. Now, since the model really rests on top of digital infrastructure, it facilitates the generation of real-time information, which can be very useful towards improving the monitoring capabilities. And also it creates opportunities for various types of innovation as well. So the question now is, how does all this work really? We are very familiar with India's digital public infrastructure in the form of Aadhaar, DigiLocker, India Stack, and so on. Now, what the SPODE does is it builds on top of that digital public infrastructure and is very fundamentally modular in nature. Typically, state governments create large citizen registries, which are basically databases which contain the demographic information of the social protection beneficiaries in a state. Typically, they are also supported by localized ID systems, which are mapped to Aadhaar in order to retain the ability to be a proof of the citizen's unique identity. Another key component is the digital platform itself, which is accessible by citizens on the one end and all participating government departments on the other. Depending on which stage of social protection we are talking about, other stakeholders can access this platform and plug into it as well, such as fair price shops, hospitals, or common service centers. Now, most SPODEs are still very much in flux. They are still systems which are growing, and each one may be structured slightly differently, but theoretically, we imagine that an SPODE could host the entire social protection delivery chain, which are the processes that you see in the brown boxes on your screens in front of you. So there are 6 processes that potentially a platform could support, starting from identifying the eligible citizens using the citizen registry, facilitating enrollment through the platform, distributing cash or non-cash benefits to citizens by various stakeholders, and even providing avenues for grievance redressal through the platform itself. Now, with that context out of the way, I'll invite Ava to take us into which stakeholders are really key to the functioning of an SPODE.
Thank you, Aishwarya. I build on Dwara's work on the sector and Apti's past work on the financing arrangements around open digital ecosystems to explore the stakeholdership that can make social protection delivery successful. Through Apti's work on last mile access, we imagine a prominent focus on citizens for stakeholders in the digital governance space. And so we find this of same relevance today. Given our focus on social protection, we are interested in understanding the ecosystem of players that make for seamless processes of availing digital social protection. From the software design of these systems and the infrastructural hardware to the face-to-face that is involved in disbursing benefits, there must be a large-scale and comprehensive structure of stakeholders that match roles and functions performed by the digital ecosystem itself. Of these, we see the citizen as the chief layer of stakeholders, resting above all actions and mindsets that are channeled by 6 other stakeholders. Through the clear classification of other stakeholders, their rights to accessibility and accountability become real. In social protection, the state ideally plays the role of oversight, regulation, enforcement, and protection. Outside of making sure that the gears around the ecosystem work, it can ensure that all other stakeholders do their part in doing the same. For financial institutions like banks and fintech services, and service providers like hospital insurance desks and LPG distributors, outside of performing their essential functions of disbursement, must take the harms and stoppages that can occur in the digital functioning of their processes and intervene appropriately to the greatest extent. They must additionally partake in reporting to ensure transparency and to that effect that the digital ecosystem has a bank of knowledge around grievance redressal efforts, mechanisms, failures, and successes. Knowledge providers like research institutions can and currently are raising awareness around the ecosystem approach for social protection. And further visibility into the roles that stakeholders can play can enable a far more broad thinking and action around the specific needs associated with digital ecosystems and how involved entities can problem solve effectively and without overlap. Technical developers arguably play the most pivotal role when it comes to making an ODE accessible for all kinds of citizens. The design, structure, usage, and interoperability thinking that mirrors and transcends the real-life experience of availing social benefits online is a task that developers, be they from the private, public, or other sectors, have to constantly scope for and solve for. Finally, last-mile intermediaries such as CSOs in India have a special significance given the digital divides we face. They represent the offline infrastructure that makes entry into the system protected and can provide crucial information into the ODE around the gaps that present themselves at the point of service delivery. It is important to note that within an open digital ecosystem, each of these 7 stakeholders can also act as SBODE innovators, allowing them to contribute to the technology of the open digital ecosystem and enhance its specificity for different citizens and users. This further invites unique collaboration and contributions, such as open source hackathons, crowdfunding, and other forms of contribution. By focusing on stakeholders in the open digital ecosystem approach, we are able to envision digital social protection delivery in terms of a role, risk, and opportunity infrastructure. I now hand over to Aishwarya to lead us through the processes involved in SPOD facilitation and opportunity for stakeholders.
Thanks, Ava. Now, as we've noted already, a standout feature of SPODEs is how stakeholders can participate in different capacities across the social protection delivery chain. And we really see 2 ways in which this can happen. Stakeholders could create new services using the SPODE infrastructure, or they could improve upon the existing services themselves. So the question here is really, how does this manifest across the different stages of the social protection delivery chain? Take the first stage of identification and enrollment, where a third party might be able to provide services in order to enhance the ability of the system to process enrollments. So there's a great example of this from the recent past, where during the pandemic, we saw how vaccine delivery was really executed through a platform, which is COIN. Now, COIN guidelines for API usage permitted private actors to provide vaccine discovery and booking services. And we saw BC networks like Spice Money and last mile organizations like Hak Darshak, which Savita represents today on our panel, provide vaccine booking services to their customers and expand the reach of the COIN platform. Now, in other stages too, we see potential opportunities for stakeholder involvement. So a private actor might build the digital infrastructure for the coordination and orchestration process, or plug into the platform in order to provide complementary offline services. The way we see it, opportunities for stakeholder improvement in an SPODE setting sound very promising, and they also require a deeper examination of whether there are any risks for the citizen and how we can mitigate those risks right off the bat before they even manifest. I'll hand it over to Lakshay to explain, with the help of a case study, what exactly this means for the citizen themselves.
You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. I'm so sorry. I was saying thanks, Ashwarya, for explaining the various opportunities for stakeholders to plug into the process of delivering social protection benefits and entitlements. Although this is a new and developing phenomenon in India, there has been significant developments in South Africa. And in this slide, I will present an example from the country where a private finance and technology firm was contracted to deliver social protection grants. Consequently, I will present a set of 4 design principles that would allow all stakeholders to build citizen-centric systems and processes while innovating solutions using the SPOD infrastructure. Coming to the example, a company named Cash Paymaster Services was contracted by the South African Social Security Agency to design a national payment and registration system to deliver social grants to the country's beneficiaries. essentially taking over the payments process of the social protection delivery chain. It succeeded in doing so, but the company used this infrastructure and the transaction history data of the beneficiaries to provide them with other financial products and services. The company issued loans to these beneficiaries against their monthly grants from the government. This caused severe distress to the beneficiaries who reported that unlawful deductions were made from their grant accounts. Predatory lending practices such as exorbitant interest rates, automatic deductions from their future grants were used to collect the repayments of the loans, which used uh, which used the beneficiary's social grants as collateral. Similarly, an initiative was reported to have been in the works in India called Kashi, Cash Over the Internet. This was planned to be a DBT based lending project, which was to use inflow from DBT schemes, demographic data, and the MFI history to ascertain creditworthiness and issue instant loans. We believe that innovating new products and services on top of the SPOD infrastructure, such as Kashi, can significantly improve financial inclusion in the country. The SPODE infrastructure, such as citizen registries, can enable financial service providers to reach out to the erstwhile financially excluded sections of society. However, the South African example shows that such innovation can lead to significant risks for the citizens. Even in India, we have seen instances of predatory digital lending to low income individuals. Hence, in order to ensure the benefits of innovation of new products using the SPOD infrastructure are materialized while the emanating risks are mitigated, we propose that the stakeholders must recognize the complementarities between innovating solutions that are economically viable and citizen centric. With that, I come to the next slide, where I present Dwara Research's 4 design principles of citizen centricity that can be leveraged by stakeholders who are looking to plug into the SPODs. In the left column, we enumerate the potential risks to the citizens while accessing services through the SPODEs. The middle column includes the design principles that stakeholders can adopt while designing their services and tech systems. And in the third column, we have some specific suggestions for stakeholders on how to implement these design principles. To begin with the risks, the first risk is of exclusion of marginalized groups. This comes from Dwara Research's extensive work in the field, and how we believe that these can be mitigated is by ensuring that stakeholders build universally inclusive systems and products. The mistreatment of data of citizens is a major risk to citizens' privacy and data protection, and stakeholders must use responsible data management measures to preserve citizens' privacy and protect their data. Another challenge often faced in these kind of services is when these services are built by trading off citizens' convenience for cost savings. We believe services built on top of SPODEs should create efficiencies of time and cost for citizens and for stakeholders. And finally, a lack of robust grievance redress mechanism limits the citizens' ability to hold stakeholders accountable. And we propose that stakeholders must provide grievance redress mechanisms to instill trust in citizens. With that, I invite my co-presenter Ava to take us through the third column.
Thank you, Lakshya. With a clear idea of the risks that can present themselves in SPODEs, we move on to what might look like great stakeholder action areas, as well as who might be ideal/relevant in the taking forward of efforts in those directions. The first is socially conscious digital design. Systems can and must be designed for greater accessibility to people who face them. And this could range from the language diversity to visual cues and simplicity. So research into even UI and UX around these systems is important. And this is a particularly crucial area for last mile intermediaries, technical developers, and service providers. The second is a harmonious regulatory and protective framework for SP-related data that centers the safety of citizens and ensures there's no conflict with respect to the access and sharing of data across stakeholders. It is important to scope what makes citizens socially vulnerable in the realm of data security. And this is a particularly crucial area for the state, financial institutions, technical developers, as well as knowledge builders. Third is navigable interoperability and online, offline fail-safes and intermediaries. It should not be difficult for a citizen to A, enroll at any stage, B, have transferability and access to their own data, and C, not have to depend on the infrastructure, but rather be driven to it. There should be physical fail-safes that, while important, must not be more convenient to use than the digital infrastructure. This requires the involvement of all stakeholders, and particularly service providers and last-mile intermediaries. Finally, we also look at offline and online grievance redressal, as Lakshay mentioned, intermediation, and self-reporting of delivery stakeholders. Transparency and reporting go hand in hand with progress and can serve the ecosystem better for improvements, both on the human and technological infrastructures that exist. Self-reporting must be an all-stakeholder activity, as well as one that is carried out in tandem. The state becomes a crucial arbiter around this process, while knowledge builders become careful watchdogs. With all this in mind, we identify 4 attributes that characterize SPODEs for citizen centricity: inclusivity, responsibility, efficiency, and accountability. I now hand over to Savita Mule from Haq Darshak to moderate this panel with a series of questions.
Thank you, Ava. Hi, everyone. Before we start the panel, a quick introduction to our panelists. We're joined by from Umidya Network India. Kriti has spent the last 10 plus years working in the space of policy research and advisory. We're also joined by Gautam Ravichander. He heads the eGov Foundation's strategy and policy work with the Government of India. Very excited to be part of this conversation and dialogue. I think social protection is a very, very important area. I think the last 2 years of the pandemic have brought it very front and center. Work has been happening, but the pandemic has really, really magnified the cracks and the opportunities equally. Before we sort of go into the questions, I just wanted to get some very high level thoughts from both Kriti and Gautam on the current landscape in terms of social protection, where you see it evolving, what is the role that your respective organizations foresee here. If we can spend a minute each. Kriti, I will start with you, and then we can get into the questions.
Thanks, Savita. Hi, Gautam. And thanks a lot, Aishwarya, Ava, and Lakshay for sharing with us a quick overview of the emerging research that Dwara and Apti are doing on social protection ODEs. First of all, I think this is, as Savita said, an extremely important area of work. The current sort of scale of impact that this wave of digitization is having, I think, across sectors is huge, and it's significantly different from earlier waves of digitization, which were more about sort of digitizing paper forms and manual processes. Now we are talking about breaking down data silos, and we are talking about creating digital rails that both private and public sector can build on top of. And social protection in particular, being a sector that directly impacts the most vulnerable sections of society, I think makes it even more important to sort of get the design right for social protection ODEs, right? And I think this work, is extremely helpful to unpack what citizen centricity actually means in this context, and then to arrive at these 4 design principles that Lakshay spoke about. I think this work is actually pioneering in this space, because social protection ODEs you know are kind of spread across states, across sort of cities, different levels of administration. It's not the case that there is one centralized system like we have in digital ID and payments, the sort of more centralized DPIs. And so I think maybe I'll sort of divide my opening remarks into sort of 3 sort of high level observations, right? One is, I think in this space there is a need to move from the principles that this work has arrived at towards standards for citizen centricity, right? And I think this is true for not just social protection ODEs, but any sort of G2C service delivery ODEs as well, right? Because just to bring it back to basics, digital platforms that we are all very familiar with and use every day, right? They have this customer acquisition motive, where there's an incentive to keep improving the performance and to acquire and retain customers. Whereas here, citizens are, often in the position of seeking government services because they have no other options. Government's the only provider. So I can ditch Zomato and go to Swiggy, but I can only get my passport renewed at a PSK. I can only, get my pension or my subsidized ration from the state. So if we can work towards, and then there's also the issue that I mentioned about, specific to social protection, that this exists at different levels of the administration, the center as well as the state as well as municipal. And so I think, if we can work towards standards that are, dynamic, that evolve as citizens' needs evolve, that are not overly prescriptive, and that help creating this almost a mindset shift to designing social protection ODEs that kind of proactively reach out to citizens and acquire them, right? Rather than sitting there and waiting for people to come because they have no choice. I think that's sort of the next big step to building on this work. And I'd love to hear more from Gautam, who I know has been, involved in making this happen practically in the urban governance sector, moving from, moving towards a standard setting kind of paradigm. I think the second thing I wanted to say is that it's important to, across these different attributes that this work has identified, right? Efficiency and responsibility and inclusion. I think it's important to have an incremental approach here. Like in tech, there's this concept of agile or iterative development, right? You roll out new modules and features as and when you build them and scale it up gradually. I think the same approach is actually needed in terms of these non-tech layers of ODEs. That is good governance and community engagement. Since the cost of getting it wrong at scale is very high, and on the other hand, having an unachievable, so idealistic set of prescriptive standards, which then puts the state and implementers on the defensive, is also counterproductive. So I think having some kind of an incremental pathway on each of these, four design principles is an important sort of next step as well. Another observation, more general one that I wanted to make is, there's this larger movement happening globally now around building digital public infrastructure and digital public goods, particularly in the wake of COVID, and other, low and middle income countries, or even developed countries for that matter, are really looking at India as a model for designing these population scale digital systems, right? Largely because of our pioneering success in digital ID and payments. And I think this is just the beginning, where ID systems are being developed by 50 plus countries based on MOSIP, which is essentially an open source platform designed on the Aadhaar model. And there are a number of countries signing on to adopt UPI as well. What this means for this, for other sectors, including social protection, I think, is that it's even more important now that what gets known as the India model is truly citizen centric, right? And here I think this work and the standards that hopefully it will lead to will become sort of globally relevant as well. Let me kind of stop there and hand over to Gautam.
Thanks, Kriti. Gautam, would love to hear your thoughts. And also,
Thank you.
I think Kriti had a point around standards and how they need to be more evolving. So, love to hear your thoughts, please.
Absolutely. So I think this is the ideal time for this conversation, right? So we've got a base that exists in terms of an ID system that can be used to improve targeting. However, there's a lot of refinement that is needed across multiple departmental systems to ensure those benefits and services get delivered to the last mile. What's also kind of important is now that we are starting to think about flows of information and flows of money, that these two start interoperating together. What do I mean by this? A frontline worker or a frontline department that's out there to deliver benefits needs to know exactly what kind of resources it's going to be getting, know it well in time so that it's able to provide that predictability to its end beneficiaries or customers, right? And the second element of this is that the flow of information on actual delivery needs to be flowing back upstream so that finance departments and government ministries are actually budgeting for the spends that they will be having in the coming weeks, the coming months, the coming quarters. And if you're able to crack that flow back and forth, then what will end up happening is the ability to manage this targeting is a lot better. So this is the first place where I think standards need to come in, right? We need to be thinking of standards for interoperability of systems. People have gone ahead and built all these systems. Let's not kind of rip them all out. They're working to some extent, some better than others, but as long as it's working, can you ensure these financial and service delivery information flows are sorted through an interoperability frameworks? We call this the unified service interface and the fiscal information exchange interface. Right? So that's the first kind of piece around standard. I also want to get to what does it take from a technology builder perspective to actually focus on the end user. And I think a large part of this is that the design needs to be grounded in the field. It's not enough for people to say, I think these boxes that I've designed on my screen, these interfaces that I have designed on the screen will work for everyone because they work for me. Ideally speaking, product designers should be rapid prototyping on the field, saying what interfaces work, what interfaces don't work, where is it failing, before a single line of code is written. Get the design right first. And that means go on the ground, prototype on the ground. Then the second element comes back to the piece of protection. I think if you want to focus on protections, we have to bake these protections into the design of the digital public goods, these software systems that then get instantiated into these public infrastructures and are used by the open digital ecosystem from day one, which means the defaults need to be set, security standards need to be set. You actually need to pass government orders to strip out protections. You actually need to pass government orders to strip out the uh, security in these systems and make it costly to do so. Design for privacy and security upfront, make it costly to strip them out. If we are able to start getting to these places as builders, then it's going to be costlier to compromise privacy. And what we can hopefully do is bake in defaults that make it easier for implementing organizations and the service delivery organizations on top to have confidence that it's baked in from day one. I'll pause there and happy to kind of dive into the discussion. Back to you, Savita.
Thank you, Gautam. Thank you, Kriti. Very, very interesting perspectives. So just to sort of carry forward from there and also linking it back to some of the questions that we're seeing on the screen. I think we talked about the four sort of attributes of citizen centricity that were identified and suggested through the study that has happened. Kriti, you mentioned that more than fixed attributes, these needs to be standards and more evolving standards. So do you see any other aspects of a SPOD that need to be factored in when you're designing, right? So principles of, for example, portability of that citizen's identity, principles of inclusion, not just from a uh, systems design perspective in terms of the policy design, but also from purely the tech design itself that Gautam was referring to. So any thoughts on any additional considerations there, and also then how do you see these helping the stakeholder ecosystem to actually build upon further as the standards evolve?
Yeah. Thanks, Savita. And I think I actually think these four attributes are quite if you think of them as four buckets, there's several things within each of them, and together they're quite comprehensive. Um, I would specifically call out different elements of citizen experience. Right, what actually happens when I interface with a digital or physical intermediary or representative of the state when I'm trying to access essential services. And I think that falls within both inclusivity and efficiency, right? How can elements of convenience that I think the team mentioned within efficiency, but also elements of how empowering or disempowering that citizen experience feels like, right? I think that's an important one to call out. In terms of conflicts between these, right? I mean, I actually think all of them are essential elements of creating trust in the digital ecosystem, especially responsibility and accountability. And that trust is really essential to drive adoption. And it's actually, I think, a fuel for innovation rather than some kind of trade-off. So when there are safeguards in place around data protection, like Gautam mentioned, when grievance redressal actually works, when institutions own accountability, I think that creates trust, not only amongst users but also trust in the innovation ecosystem, the creators and contributors, and tech developers who are sort of building on top of the core infrastructure. So I don't see them as being, in conflict with each other.
Thanks. Gautam, any thoughts here on this topic?
Absolutely. I think I don't think they're conflicting with each other. In fact, I believe that if we need to tackle these, however, we need to be thinking at multiple layers, right? So we spoke about policy design and system design, but in between that, there's program design. How do these programs roll out? How do they get delivered through the various channels that exist? Here, I think it should be important for tech builders to be highly agnostic to whether people are using the interfaces that they have specifically developed, or whether they're using offline interfaces like intermediaries, citizen service centers, kiosks. And I think the one unlearning that needs to happen is to stop worrying about how many active direct citizen users there are and to really focus on how many services and benefits are being delivered through that digital infrastructure. Because we are a country in transition and not everyone's going to be a direct user of these systems. So that's one piece of unlearning that will need to be done so that this principle can be realized. In terms of responsibility and accountability, I agree with Kriti. I don't think they are contradictory. But from the point of innovation, standards again play a role here. If all uh, departments, if all people know that information is going to flow in certain ways, then they are able to prepare for designing their software solutions, their program interventions, their budgets, and their field plans in a way that that information can be relied upon to flow across all departments in that same way. So standards actually promote innovation, don't reduce innovation, right? Because it's a minimal standard around which you can innovate on the program side, you can innovate on the policy side, you can innovate on the tech side, and have all of these happen independently and still work together well. I'll pause there.
Thank you. I think great thoughts. I would, in the interest of time, want to move forward with the next topic. I think some very interesting areas to deep dive into, right? So, just taking the example of what happened in the South Africa example that Lakshay talked about, um, how do you see the role of the private sector? So definitely, private sector uh, is going to be involved, should be involved. Given the massive scale, I think that is the only way to drive more innovation and scale in the ecosystem. But how do you foresee the private sector being able to leverage the standards, the principles of design that are being discussed here, and uh, what role do you foresee the private sector to be playing in the design and implementation, and more importantly, leveraging this infrastructure to develop further in the space of social protection, in your view? Kriti, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Savita. I think, I think it's firstly, since we are talking about social protection systems, it's important to, recognize that the role of the state is much more central in social protection delivery. And, so I think we should be clear that the accountability piece, for this sector should continue to, in my view, rest with the state and not, get diluted in any way. I think at the same time, we have to recognize that there are some things that the government does well, and some things that the government doesn't do well at all, like designing good UI UX, right? And so I think there is definitely a important role for a private sector to play here, and ways in which this can be done, high level thoughts. One is, I think, just having clear and transparent rules of engagement for the private sector, whether it's through a an open sandbox kind of a setup like what the NDHM has, and I think the urban digital mission has developed as well. But essentially, we need to move away from this current paradigm of government procuring private sector tech vendors through these tendering processes that are a race to the bottom, right? And move towards government creating these clear rules of engagement, as Gautam said, standards on how information will flow, right? And offering basic digital infrastructure, opening it up for private sector to innovate on top, while retaining the accountability of the state, especially in things like social protection. Then I think the second one would be this commitment to improving user experience through feedback loops. That needs to come in, and that's a place where the private sector can play an important role. I think both in terms of digital and physical interfaces. This the government can learn from all of these platforms that we use every day, right? If Zomato can constantly update their interface, why not a Me Seva app or any other sort of government apps? I think, yeah, those are the two sort of things in my mind for private sector engagement in this sector. I think in other sectors the scope is actually broader for private sector engagement.
Thanks, Priti. No, I think I absolutely agree in the sense that the accountability should rest with the state. It is a primary responsibility there. But you're right in saying that the private sector has a role to play in how the delivery happens. How do you make it more efficient in all aspects? So absolutely with you on that front. Gautam, any thoughts from your side on this?
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure that we'll be able to walk away from the procurement element of establishing BPIs, right? And this is an ongoing conversation, and there's significant work that needs to be done on restructuring the government financial rules to enable a more flexible procurement model. But in the interim, till that happens, I think we can think about how these RFPs are spec. So first of all, uh, are there incentives around availability, right? So rather than looking at whether the system is being used by a lot of people, just ensure it's up and available regardless of usage. And that should be one base layer of uh, incentive so that private sector folks invest in building systems that are running all the time when they need to work. The second element then comes down to quality of how the system actually works for end users. And here there's a lot that can be done through both system-based feedback, but also through the kind of surveys that you have done to look at the gaps in how the systems are working on the ground, and then working that feedback back into the design of the system so that your payment tranches are linked to that. The third part of it then comes back to harms and mitigations. If there is enough monitoring happening to identify where harms are happening, then we need to have some element of mitigation also built in. So a case like what happened in, say, South Africa would have incurred penalties, and that's baked into the contract. And those penalties need to be much higher than the cost of service delivery so that service providers don't have that incentive to bend the rules at the edges where no one's looking. So these are my first three thoughts in terms of how you can optimize for a bit of citizen centricity there. I think the other element is some amount of design thinking and innovation needs to always go into the design of these systems. So when they're getting spec'd, don't just listen to the bureaucrats that you're engaging with, also work with end users. And if that is not baked into these RFPs, that needs to be as a basic checklist that the design has been done with the front lines rather than just with people in the offices.
Absolutely, absolutely. So moving on to the next sort of area of discussion, and we'll keep it very brief. I'll request Kriti and Gautam to sort of note the time here. But last mile intermediaries, right? I think we are all aware that while we are talking digitization, digital transformations, we are still a country where a lot of offline exists, a lot of need for last mile support exists. How do you see, what role do you see the last mile service providers, last mile stakeholders play a role in the not just from the design but also to the end use of such systems that we're talking about here? Kriti, any thoughts here if you'd like to share, please?
Yeah, I think this is an extremely important piece of the whole, of the whole SPOD puzzle, right? In my mind, there are formal, more formal and less formal intermediaries. Many government schemes and policies actually have the role of intermediaries, clearly defined and built into program implementation, right? The livelihoods missions, for example, and the NRLM and NULM at their core rely on this social capital of self-help groups who are in some sense intermediaries to the community, and an established network of SHGs, I think, and their federations is an extremely powerful social architecture that can actually complement a digital service delivery architecture, right? But we also need to, of course, stop dumping more and more work on SHGs, right? So two things that I think need to be done in this context of recognized or sort of more formalized sort of intermediaries, right? One is capacity building of these community based organizations and frontline workers like the ASHA workers, etc., so that they're not, the burden on them should not increase as a result of digital intermediation coming in, but should decrease. So designing for them as users in addition to the citizen as the end user. um, I think there are also so many different types of informal intermediaries. This is actually one of the emerging insights from an ongoing study that we have on the next half billion population segment, which is basically the 500 million Indians who have come online between 2017 and 2022, and who broadly represent the bottom 60% of the household income pyramid, right? And I remember one of the interviewers said something like, every month I transfer money using phone pay to a neighbor in the village, who then converts it into cash and deducts 10 rupees and then hands over the rest to my wife, right? How do you design for these kind of informal intermediaries? I think is a harder question, and something that I don't actually have answers to. But I think the first step in both is sort of recognizing the importance of these last mile intermediaries and acknowledging that not all users have the ability to interface digitally and use sort of self-serve modes to access government services.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, Gautam, I'll direct the last question, last topic here to you. In your experience, what are some of the key learnings, some of the key things that the ecosystem needs to keep in mind when, especially around stakeholder engagement, right? And we're talking about at least 6 identified stakeholders from the research that the team has done so far. What are some of the learnings, if you can share in brief? I know we have about 2 minutes and we'll need a couple of minutes to recap. So I'll hand it over to you for a quick point of view on this.
So I think the key element of this goes back to co-design, right? I think every iteration on open digital ecosystems is trying to get better at design, but just the fundamental processes of how systems of government work takes away the incentive to have that co-design and use the powerful arm of law and the power of the government to force behavior changes on the ground. And that always blows back and fails. So if we can, from day one, think of co-design and be open to the feedback and say, yes, that changes how we were thinking of the program, how we were thinking of policy. That's the first lesson that's there. It's harder, but in the long run, it's better because it's actually involved everyone and it's taking that incremental approach. I think the second element of it then comes down to looking at these systems not as accountability systems, but as empowering the front line, right? And typically speaking, in most conversations, making that shift happen within the government machinery's imagination takes a lot of work. So a classic example is to say if an ASHA worker in the real world has to fill out 48 fields or 48 forms on a daily basis, how many of those can be reduced because you're using a digital system rather than saying, let's replicate that and then add more checks and balances on top of that? And I don't think that's the default in the imagination from the front lines for the design, right? So the physical world gets translated in a very literally digitized way to the digital world without really saying where can we strip the load. And without that sensibility, what will end up happening is they will abandon these systems. And then we'll say, oh, but the services aren't being delivered and they are at fault, which is not true. It's the collective ecosystem of designers and policymakers and program runners who are at fault because they didn't account for the front lines. I'll just pause with that.
Thank you, Gautam. I think we are almost at time. Eva, we can take a minute to recap and then I'll hand it over to you guys. All right. So I think thank you, Kriti and Gautam, for some great insights into the design principles. How do you make SPODs more citizen-centric? I think the notion of citizen centricity by itself in a lot of systems is difficult to achieve, but then more critical, especially in the case of social protection. Some very interesting thoughts from Kriti talking about developing more standards, more evolving interoperable standards that will inform flow of data, flow of information, flow of financial information, as Gautam was saying, and then allow those standards to drive the innovation across all stakeholder groups while keeping the accountability of that SPOD and the privacy security concerns around it baked into the framework itself, which the government is then going to own, right? So great insights. I'm sure there'll be more conversation and dialogue on this topic as we go forward. I will hand it over to Eva, Aishwarya, and Lakshay to summarize the session and close it from there. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Kriti and Gautam, for your great insights.
Sorry, am I audible? All right. Well, I feel like you've said it all, Savita, but thank you so much, Gautam and Kriti. The session has been really great in terms of understanding what it may require to go into the needs of social protection under an open digital ecosystem. But what is great to hear from our panelists is the infrastructures that already exist and the challenges they face and how that can inform our study of these things even better. Stakeholdership, of course, is pivotal to making sure that the system runs smoothly, but that, of course, requires a much deeper analysis around the ideal roles that these stakeholders can play. But thank you once again. And if there's no other comments or thoughts, we can conclude the session. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you once again, Savita.